They took their normal prayer before beginning the hunt in earnest. With such a welcome to the forest, it felt appropriate to pray for guidance and gratitude as they began the work that lay ahead under those knotted branches. Ibrahim certainly felt the need. He'd always hated these woods. They were called the Nar Amar, the Red River Woods, but he'd always thought of them as the Blood River. His arrival at Fallback Bay had been with the Ansar back during the war, along with everyone else, pretty much. Back when the town was just a collection of houses clustered on the waterfront, when the place earned its name. The Imperial troops had been surging for weeks through Verdant's placid heartland, pushing the increasingly desperate defenders back. Not everyone had made it. Their entire brigade had been drawn into a tattered line of retreat, doom and fire hounding them on all sides. They'd been properly decimated by the time they entrenched among the fishing huts and thanked their god that the town had a functional water pump, power, and food. The onrushing Rafadani infested the surrounding hills close behind them, nipping at stragglers and eyeing the beleaguered town with eyes full of hate and greed. But they'd made a terrible mistake. In their hunger for the blood of the rebellious Verdant coalition, the Imperials had stretched their own supply lines thin as well, and they were far more vulnerable to disruption. The VTOL hoppers that lifted them from place to place with breakneck speeds required fuel and maintenance that loitered halfway across the Harak Desert, and their sophisticated mechanized troops were vulnerable to gaps in the supplies they needed to continue the fight. Arguably, the Haterites couldn't have advanced beyond Fallback Bay if they'd wanted to. This strategic error gave the defenders the chance they needed. The bluffs and hills around the town hosted vicious combat for days on end. Pacer Patrol was made up of the survivors of P Company of those terrible times, as they wrestled control of the high points around the region from the invaders. From there, they established air defenses, severing the flight-dependent logistics train of the Imperial forces, and slowly, inexorably, sawing off the head of the Rafadani monster. A monumental glory that Ibrahim couldn't feel, and didn't seem to understand beyond the bare events. "I think this is it." Isara's voice floated next to his ear. "Looks just like Kanfasa tracks." "Kanfasa? Or whatever that was?" Jermel responded before Bahir could cut in edgewise. "I don't know the tread of whatever that was." "One or the other." "Thought you were a doctor of biology or something." Mysara's response was a sarcastic snort, which her gut could somehow interpret and communicate. They really were amazing machines. Ibrahim answered for her instead. "One bug's as good as another. You can follow it?" "Can't promise it'll be quick, but yeah, it's a game trail, looks like." "You track. Nasri, point. Let's get this done so we can go home." They carried on, but at a slower pace. The Ghazis, veterans of the war, didn't want to be here any more than Ibrahim did. Their novices might take it for reluctance, well, Bahir perhaps, but all of the Ansari knew full well what horrors lurked underneath the shadows of the trees. The red-veiled forests had been the headquarters of the Hadarite terror troops, the Al-Mutarik. The artillery of those monsters issued at a rate that seemed ceaseless from the heart of the woods in those days, pounding the original town to pulp and destroying the well and generator. Not before they could take their fill first, praise be. The highlands collapsed quickly under the Ansar's retributive fury, but the forest was another thing entirely. All throughout the war, the elite, maroon-clothed Al-Mutarik had earned their reputation tenfold. Merciless, heartless, brutal. As much ink as blood had been spilled in their depiction, and anyone who ever faced them knew no words could do it justice. They emerged from the stalactite trees with their robotic death squads in the dead of night, the teeth of the dead as prizes dangling from their glinting bayonets. Fearless, bloodless, cruel. Disciplined, as unerring as the warbots they commanded. There were rumors that they themselves were half-machine, the only explanation for their aim and speed and pitiless eyes. That the steel bones of the machines were theirs as well, and that the metal had seeped into their souls. They felt neither heat nor cold, knew no pain or fear, such were the terrible mists that swirled around the Al-Mutarik, and it had been to Ibrahim and his companions to enter this forest, find them, and kill them. He knew in his bones that he hadn't ever left the forest. His soul was still tethered to it like Sisyphus in the stone. The Al-Mutarik had made this place into a hell of their own design. Though they had felt the pain and panic of battle as intensely as ever, the forest shrouded everything in gloom. The photo arms and firearms of their hidden assailants cut thin trace lights through the midnight fog, flicking on the very edges of perception. But the attendant eruptions, the thunder of the laser burst strike, and the staccato tear of the cannon at speed, was muted, muffled in the dense foliage and air that felt too thick to breathe. It stifled the lungs and smothered the cries of the wounded and frightened and dying alike. Warbots emerged from the dark to billow out great gouts of fire as toxin smoke crawled inexorably through the valleys, but even a few feet away these dangers were half blocked by the underbrush. The gnarled arms of the Electa made the world small, everything snared up in their hardened branches, as trapped as fish in their gloomy net. The Empire was no technological power, but were adept at reclaiming and adapting old order machinery to their purposes, and those machines were the stuff of nightmares. They fought like devils with endless vigor and ruthless enthusiasm, directed by their evil masters to enact the most criminal suffering. But that wasn't what he remembered most. It was the droning. The Almutarik sang in battle, a guttural meditation that vibrated unknowable ululations deep in their throats. Had to write prayers, garbled through dozens of speakers. Prayers for the dead, to prepare the dying for their arrival in hell. The sound of their anti-harmonies was broadcast from the warbots, rippling from machine to machine in a chaotic rolling bank of sound that raised hackles and heartbeats simultaneously. He and the others quickly learned to avoid firing on the noisy ones. They were distractions from the real threats, but more than a few panic-stricken Ghazi had opened up on them all the same, only to be caught in a lethal crossfire milliseconds later as their position was revealed. Ibrahim couldn't blame them either. As Pacer Patrol carried on into the shadow, he could swear that rumbling dirge still lingered on the edge of audibility. Suhail remembered the dead that fell here, and remembered the suffering that had tormented these hollows and hills. He could hear it in the faint breeze, in the chaotic clicking of fat water droplets on fronds. This blood-soaked place still had ghosts lingering in every shadow, and he knew that if he died unworthy of heaven, he would be one of the shades that flitted in the gloom. His greatest fear was that, in his heart, he thought that he might deserve it. Ibrahim. Nasri's voice touched his mind through their link. The "Are you all right?" was left unsaid. "Yeah," he replied, needing no other words. Perimeter. The patrol checked their perimeter, as they had done frequently in their 2 hours of hiking. It was slow going for all of them, even the two who only struggled with tree roots and were blissfully unaware of the ghosts that slid from every dark corner. Maisara and Bahir both showed as anxious and with elevated attention on his gut, but nothing unexpected. He snorted as he checked his own readings. Worse than theirs. The whole patrol was a little rattled. Maisara, surprisingly, was the most composed. Focusing on following the trail ahead of her was keeping anxiety at bay. "Full perimeter," he corrected. Procedure would do them all good. The only truly serene member of the patrol was Raza, dutifully lumbering over and under and through with all of their equipment. It pinged out another set of sophisticated scans to provide them with a thorough survey, something they never would have risked in the bad old days. Too visible, too dangerous. Kanfasa fortunately didn't have RF interception hardware that the Almutarik did. Shadowy forms became brighter with digital correction, overlaid with what information the scans could provide. The images were all still. Raza only made a single sensor pass, but it was enough. Frozen ghosts now replaced the illusory ones, and it was better. They were real and comfortable for the Suhaili soldiers. Each took a slice and added their own mental notations of what they could identify and assess, compiling into a full threat assessment that combined the best that technology and human attention could provide. The forests were full as ever. It was the end of the rainy season, after all, when life was vibrant and energetic, exuberant with the bounty of the skies. Crawling and scuttering things in the thick, mushy leaf litter, clambering and scaling things in the arms of the trees, swooping things in the narrow spans between them. Ibrahim felt better. It was a forest. It was living. While the place was cursed for him, a glimmer of the hidden business of the trees brought him a measure of comfort. It was still God's creation. There was good here, even if it wasn't there for him. Not many animals this time of year. Mysara's voice bubbled over the link. Her tone confirmed his appraisal. She sounded in good spirits and very much on task. She came into the edge of the forest from time to time as part of her remote college courses, and this work was close enough to that for her to feel comfortable deeper in. "How do you mean?" he asked. "Almost no charismata, and the Seleucids are here, but they're hiding. They should be harvesting water and leaf cuttings right now." Ibrahim had a bad feeling about the conditions with the Canvasa from the start, and this only doubled it. He asked Mysara to look into that more closely, do some science to it, as he put it. This seemed more and more like a natural problem, but a natural problem with an unnatural source. Perhaps some old imperial power source was leaking toxins into the mud, or some radiation source had become exposed in the flare season and it was causing some sort of strange behavior. It was outside of his understanding, but others in Pacer could perhaps grapple with it better. "Contact. 11. Fasia's cool voice intoned in his head, snapping his attention to a report immediately. Ibrahim looked up and over, and his heart caught in his throat. Behind the trees, but caught by the mule's penetrating radar, the shrouded shade of a human figure. It had been caught sliding through the dark, the image now frozen as a misty outline. It was featureless, merely a silhouette of some spectral figure, hooked staff in hand. He could swear that the dappling of sparse light from above made it seem like a pair of blazing eyes stared back at him. His breath held, taut and narrow, and the whole world seemed to freeze likewise. But only for a moment. Instincts that kept him alive back then were burned indelibly into him now. "Nasri, left. Fasia, right. Stay here, Raza. Fasia, I want eyes on our ghost." Pacer slid into action, quiet and cautious, and the Ansar showed their mettle. The unease and physical anxiety in their biosigns smoothed over as if smothered under a blanket, still present, but clamped down. Breathing slowed, heartbeats grew even. Bahir and Mysara were simply incapable of such feats of self-control yet, and he didn't blame them. He hoped they never had to learn those lessons, in fact. The others unconsciously moved to provide the novices better cover and more space, and Ibrahim felt pride bolster his shaking nerves. They were professionals, far from the terrified kids that had somehow managed to beat back the greatest terrors of the marked man's war. They were prepared for whatever might come. Fasia was in position before the others had taken their places, Mysara and Safe shortly behind her to set up covering arcs. She'd always been a rock for Pacer, even back then. She terrified everyone back in Fallback Bay with her piercing gaze and almost machine-like efficiency, all traits that were burned into her by the war. Only a few knew the real Fasia, full of cynicism and compassion. They only saw the blunt, hard-nosed exterior she developed as armor for herself. Ibrahim couldn't see it. He could only see the terror of that night when she'd saved his life from the kettlehead, her wide eyes reflecting the burning bodies it had cut through before she put it down. He could only see the grief and laughter wavering side by side in them at the taverna back in Fallback Bay, late at night, as they tried to drown their memories in cheap alcohol and dirty jokes. He thought to marry her back in those days, but he knew she'd say no. Like him, she was bound to the past. He, at least, had been able to find one woman to share his life with, have a son, but part of his soul would always be alone, just like her. Cameras tightened and zoomed at Fasia's mental direction as she crawled in the cover of the wet undergrowth, red trees shading her slate-brown camouflage. No words, just the visual signal, which they could all watch from positions of greater safety and distribution. Ibrahim shed the contemplative thoughts as those images came to his mind. No ghosts, no warbots shuddering and moaning, no Almutarik from beyond the grave with their glassy eyes and clattering prize teeth. A short, broad figure in a voluminous ashen cloak that draped from collar to knee, and a steel helmet with lensed eyes. A veil was hung from the bottom edge of the eyepieces and full around the helm's ring, down to the shoulder in lightweight gray fabric. A crookstaff, primitive, with an elongated metal hook that was bladed sharp on the outer edge and blunt on the inside, more a spear than a traditional hook staff. No handcaster, no oxy-tanks, no visible accessories, though the cloak draped broad enough to be hiding nearly anything. Pacer patrol fanned out as the figure proceeded, oblivious to their presence. Ibrahim watched through Fasia's eyes as they all set in place. Their stranger was moving quickly, but with a comfortable fluidity, both cautious and sure. They were gliding more than walking, in utter silence, as if they were a creature of the forest. A predator. Moments later, Ibrahim gave his silent assent across the link. Hidden weapons tensed as Nasri vocally called out an order from behind the protection of a dense hedge. "Verdant Mineteers, stop where you are." The figure froze in place, their head tilting to one side. Both of their gloved hands were visible, held outward for balance as they prowled, but there could be anything under that cloak. What manner of person would be stalking a cursed forest like this at the end of rain season? Tree harvesters were the only ones that came out here these days, as infrequently as possible, if he could help it. This person clearly wasn't that either. No taps, no mule, no supplies. Whoever they weren't here on typical business. Nothing good came from this forest. It never had, and it never would. Nasri continued. "I need you to spread your arms out slowly. Hands out of the cloak." The stranger didn't comply. They stayed frozen in place but for the index finger on their staff, which raised up. "Wait," the gesture seemed to say. Then the wrist tilted, angling the pointed stave towards the undergrowth ahead of them. "Look." Abraham ordered another pulse from Raza, and as the hazy sweep of the scan rippled outwards, the mist caught, congealing into the creeping forms of a clutch of Kanfasa on the prowl. The stranger had been hunting them, and Nasri's call had alerted the creatures to their presence. He cursed and barely had time to order, "Arms up!" before the leaves and branches burst in a fountain of angry chitin. Two erupted from the cover of trees towards the stranger, who deftly batted one into the next with the hook of their staff as they slid from the scythe of insectile claws. Another slammed into Raza's side a heartbeat later, staggering the pack machine into a drunken gait before driving it to the ground. A third shrieked as it came at Nasri from behind, torn in half as soon as it arrived by Bahir and Jermel's deft reflexes. Ibrahim's handcaster came up and split the domed back of another that was crouching to spring on him, turning its leap into a doomed tumble into the mud. A sudden gush of incandescent light and heat forced him instinctively back into the hollow of the tree beside him. Not Canvasa's burning spittle in his mind, but the hideous gouts of pitiless fire from an Al-Zahif warbot. The incendiary rockets and napalm mate taking cover in foliage, a bargain with the devil while those mechanical arachnids were about. He found his hands sweating in their gloves, gripping too tightly onto the reassuring weight of his handcaster. Just bugs. For all the cunning and surprising resiliency of this new breed, they were no warbots. There was no haughty Almutarig lurking in the shadows, warbling their haunting cry. An arc of fire lanced the ground beside the stranger ahead of them. One of the Kanfasa lay dying of a stab wound through its throat, while the other was still very much alive. The bug's opponent was a duelist, it seemed. Their hooked stave wrestled and tossed the beast as it tried to lunge past without taking a spear through the chest. He acknowledged the all-clear responses from his team as they went through the perimeter check and lined up kill shots to support the stranger's struggle when they could. He was fascinated, though. This stranger was deft with that bladed crook staff in a way that few were, moving with confidence that seemed in stark odds with the deadly speed of the Formacid's bites. Not many tangled with beasts as ferocious as they. By the look of it, too, they looked to be much more like someone from one of the Badaweg tribes. Most resolvers liked the little decoration on their clothing and gear, but none quite so elaborate as the traditionalist nomads. While the crookstaff the stranger swung in swooping arcs was more a primitive blade on a stick than the sophisticated tool that most Suhaili carried, it was embossed in floral decoration and trimmed in engraved precious metals. Badaweg, more than likely. This raised more questions than answers. The Badaweg moved in regular patterns from oasis to oasis on the edge of the great desert. It was unheard of to find them alone, far from their traditional grounds. It also occurred to Ibrahim that this could be their missing tourist, but if so, what had compelled a Badaweg to come here? By ferry, of all things. The duel stopped abruptly as the Formacid's back exploded, its thick shell cracking and splitting in a wet burst of boiling blood that striped the stranger from head to hip. They froze mid-strike as their foe collapsed, and Ibrahim could hear Bahir in his mind. "Sorry, it was taking too long." A couple chuckles from the group's link followed as the stranger stayed still a moment later, expressionless but somehow radiating annoyance and surprise at the same time. Ibrahim stood up from cover, the full perimeter check ensuring that no further threats lurked within the immediate surroundings. All but one, at least. He still didn't trust this nomad, but he should be safe if he kept out of reach of that deadly hook. It was still glazed with sticky ichor from the gaps in the canfasa's shells, and would no doubt do just as well in the gaps of his armor if the stranger thought them enemies. "What are you doing here?" His tone was blunt. There were no laws against hunting, but that was because there were no laws against chute-less skydiving either. Stalking enormous fire-breathing wolf beetles was, in its own way, a combined punishment and deterrence, and this stranger here was pursuing that fate eagerly. Just at the time when a new breed appeared to be taking over, too. Too much coincidence. They didn't answer. The figure's head turned to face the Minotaur captain instead, eyes hidden behind the protection of the ruby-red lenses in their helmet. It was an imposing gaze. Steam and vapor rose in thin wisps from the strange formacid's corrosive blood as the figure's glare shot daggers through the semi-opaque eyes, but their stance relaxed. The crookstaff's jeweled butt touched the ground as they reached under their cloak, and even though a half-dozen photo arms raised at the potential threat, the figure withdrew a cloth instead of a weapon, and began to wipe at the acidic smear of Bahir's overeagerness. "You will tell us your name and why you're here, or we're dragging you back to town in cuff straps. Your choice." Ibrahim was losing patience, and was eager for the stranger to give a reason to leave this horrible forest behind. He could hear them grumbling under the weight and cover of their clothing while trying to daub away the steaming ichor. He did get a reply after a moment longer, though. "Froya." It was a woman's voice, though her accent was so thick it was impossible to tell more than that. "Name's Froya." Her head turned, and she shot a glance in Bahir's general direction, who had burst the bug in her face. There was a burble of back-channel gossip and laughter as the novice caught the full intensity of the Badaweg's ire. Ibrahim cajoled them back to attentiveness as the stranger finished. "Saw trouble with Kanfasi yesterday. So I help. That closed one hole in the events of the day. This Froya was their tourist." He tilted his head slightly as he instructed his gut to send a message back to the Minotaur's control center back in town. "Fallback Central, this is Pacer Patrol. We have the tourist. Wandering in the forest. We'll escort her back to town. Over." He watched her clear the last of the smoldering smear of gore from her as he waited on the reply, leaving her dappled grey cloak a little worse for wear. Ibrahim had been keeping tabs on the search going on and was glad to be able to call it off. Selim's team was from the utilities co-op and was supposed to be asleep right now. Good to get them back to bed. Maybe 30-40 people out looking for this sun-baked idiot. Fisa's voice in his ear sounded just as relieved. "Got it, Pacer. That's great. Let's get everyone home. Do you need airlift? Over." "No Central. No good clearings nearby. We're mobile. We'll contact once we're mounted. Tell Aisha to hold tight. Out." Ibrahim turned his attention back to the tourist, who was squatting down beside the steaming remains of the formacid. It was already collapsing, the intense acid of its inexplicable biology set free on its own corpse to dissolve tendons and chitin into a sodden mass of meat and shell. She had a knife out, prying off a thick plate above one of the paws, some sort of a natural knuckle guard. The glove she wore looked heavy and resilient, but even then she was careful to avoid the grotesque viscera of the beast as it collapsed from the inside. "All right, we've got trucks, about 2.5 hours back. We'll have you back in town just after sunset." "No." The soft-spoken reply was immediate. "Pardon?" She flicked her wrist, the knife tip pointing out a direction that roughly followed the course of the low ravine in which they had encountered both her and the creatures. He peered into the russet brambles, calling for a pulse from Raza to check his instincts. "Mysara, is that your trail?" "No, that's up on the ridgeline." The scan resolved to its highest resolution, and he thought he could make out some scarring in the loamy soil under the dappled bushels of the undergrowth. Another trail, perhaps. That's what it seemed by the way the tourist had been going, in the same direction at least. It was probably on the trail they needed to follow, but there was no way he could let her go traipsing off alone in search of them. "It's dangerous. You can't be alone out here." Barely an acknowledgement. He scowled behind his glassy faceplate. "We haven't got the time or resources to protect you out here." The scale from the formacid's body finally peeled free, stretching a skein of tough, stretchy tissue behind it. She stood and, for the first time, looked at him squarely. Shorter, broader at the shoulder beneath the cape, and completely inscrutable. The red-tinted lenses set into her helmet showed no hint of the eyes beneath, and even less emotion, Whatever her intentions were, it felt to Ibrahim like he was sharing a gaze with a completely alien creature. Fazia's voice floated next to his thoughts. She looks like she knows what she's doing. That's the problem. She could be involved in this. What do you mean? He could feel the exertion in Fazia's voice as she pulled the mule free from the tangled knotroot vine it had fallen into. These Kanfasa aren't here naturally. They can't be. Someone brought them. She seems pretty comfortable killing them. Doesn't mean anything. Could be they were imported, but might have arrived before Biryu, too. There are migrations around the edge of the desert that happened before then. Fazia was right, though. This tourist, whoever they might be, seemed far more adept at tracking than Maisara. She proved capable in fight and curiously fearless in a way that only familiarity afforded. Not uncharacteristic for the nomadic communes, but still leaving open all manner of questions. It seemed very unlikely to Ibrahim that an able hunter would show up at the very moment they were needed in this way. He glared back at the impassive Bataweg, his eyes far more visible beneath his faceplate than her featureless ruby lenses. "All right, you can come with us. You seem to know what you're doing, and we could use a tracker. Stay close. We can't airlift you out from here if you're hurt." Generous. The Bataweg's flat sarcasm was thick as she gestured with her knife again, in the direction of her hidden trail, before both it and the scale disappeared beneath the gossamer fabric that hid her from view. The shadows of the deeper forest beckoned. "That way."